Alright, in this lesson we're going to look at variables, inputs, and then sort of how to display those outputs. We have two ways to display things. That's a label and a message box. And remember from our lesson, labels we've been using for quite a bit now. Labels are found right here in the toolbox. The other one, message boxes, are actually built into Visual Basic and into Visual Studio. We'll kind of see how they both work. All right. First, I want you to take a look at the form that I have here. Here I have basically an addition calculator. I've renamed the text of my form. All right, remember, you can rename the text of an object, and so I've renamed the text of my form right here to addition calculator. I also have two text boxes, and if you remember from our study of toolboxes, the text box is located right here. All right, and the purpose of a text box is to accept input from a user. All right, so that's really the key for our text box. So when you're using a text box, you should not use it for anything else other than to accept the input from the user. Now, I know there are other ways to use a text box, but primarily for our class, we're going to use a text box to accept the input. In other words, what the user is going to actually put into the program. All right, and if you look here, we have basically two labels. So these two right here are labels. We have two text boxes, text box 1 and a text box 2. And then finally, we also have a button 1 again. Notice how I've changed this to, say, addition on it, again, because this is going to be an addition calculator. All right, so let's go and look at our coding. First thing we want to do is when we look at our coding, you notice everything's kind of very blank here. Now, when we talk about variables, we have to remember that a variable simply stands for a value. In other words, it represents a value in the program. And what we want to do is we want to take in two inputs, turn them into variables, add them together, and then output our variable into a message box. And we want to do that whenever we click on the button. Now, one thing that you may figure out and you may kind of play around with is you can figure out that if you double click on the text box, this will make something, make a private sub called a text changed. For our sakes, we don't really want to mess with this. This gets really confusing and it kind of can mess up your program a little bit. So we're going to ignore using the private sub text box 1 text change for right now. Instead, we're going to actually double click on our button 1. All right, and so let's put a little space between here, our public class form 1, which represents our form, and then our private sub button 1. Now this space right here, this is our area where we declare our variables. And so the key to a good program is you need to determine how many variables you need for that program. Now, here we have two inputs, two text boxes, and we're going to add them together to another number. So that probably tells us that we're going to need 3 variables. You may not need exactly 3 variables, but for the most part, 3 variables at the very least. All right. So I'm going to write a comment saying this is where we declare our variables. So we're going to declare them in this little area right between the public class form 1 and the private sub button 1. All right. The reason we want to do that is because we want to use those variables throughout the entire program. And if we only declare it in the private sub, which you could do, you could declare your variables inside the private sub. If you declare a variable inside the private sub, remember my rule, what happens in the private sub stays in the private sub. All right, so if you declare a variable in the private sub, then it'll only stay in the private sub, and we can't use it anywhere else, and that can give us problems later on. So we want to have 2 numbers that we're going to declare. Now remember our naming convention for how we declare a variable. We start with the keyword dim. Dim kind of tells the program, hey, we're about to declare a variable. It doesn't always mean that, but for our sakes, that'll work fine. Now after dim will come the variable name. All right, so let's go and declare the 2 inputs that we're going to take from the user. We can call them input 1 and input 2. Remember, our variables are nothing more than a placeholder for the values that we're going to have. All right, and this should be a little bit of review from our lesson, but we'll call this one input 1. And then remember the next thing is as. And if you look, the program automatically fills that in for us. So dim input 1 as. Now, remember, when we're declaring something, we have to give it a specific data type. If we go back to our form, we're taking in 2 numbers. So because we're taking in 2 numbers, that should tell us that we're actually going to be taking in either an integer or a double, not a string. All right, because remember, strings are text values. You cannot add or subtract them really. They don't really have any value as numbers. They're kind of text values. So we're going to say these are going to be integers. So I'm going to declare input 1 as integer. All right, oops, did not spell integer right. Missing E. There we go. So we're going to declare input1 as integer. Now, what I like to do is what you should do is after every variable, go ahead and write a comment that describes why you declared this variable. So I'll say we declared input1 as integer to be used as an input, or something like that. Again, it doesn't have to be that descriptive, but you need to tell yourself exactly kind of what's going on with that coding there. Now, when we get into bigger projects, you can be more specific with your variables. Maybe you're using a variable for health, or a variable for the tip, or something like that. All right. Second one, we're going to call dim input2 as integer. Again, same naming convention. All right, and nothing, I'll just say declared input2 as integer, just for sake of argument. I'll keep it a little bit shorter. And then finally, I want to do one more. We'll call dim total as integer. And I'll say this is our variable to calculate the total. All right, so remember, I want to have two inputs. This is my input 1, my input 2, and then my total. This is what I'm going to add both of the input 1s and input 2s into. All right. Now, with the input 1 and the input 2, I want to add them, but I want to take in the user's input from the text box. All right, because right now, if you remember from our lesson, at this point in the coding, input 1, input 2, and total, I have not given them an initial value. So this means that all three of these variables, since they're integers, have an initial value of 0. All right, got to remember that. They have an initial value of 0. Now, remember, when we talk about taking something in from the input, remember my rule with the equal sign. Whatever's on the left side of the equal sign is going to receive whatever's on the right side. So, if we want to take in the inputs from TextBox1 and TextBox2 and then set them to our variables input1 and input2 accordingly, we'll write something like this. Input1 is equal to TextBox1.text, and we'll end it right there. So notice what happens here. We're taking in the text from TextBox1 and then setting that equal to our input1. And so I'll write a comment here saying sets input1 to TextBox1. Basically telling myself when I do this, input1 is going to receive the value of whatever's in the TextBox1.text. All right. And then we'll do the same thing for input 2, except this time we're going to go TextBox2. All right. And once again, .text, and we'll say sets input2 to TextBox2. All right, so now here we've set both of our inputs, our variables, to the respective text boxes. All right. Again, if you flip this around, if you had the text box here and the input on the other side, that would actually not work. All right. So remember, whatever's on the left side receives whatever's on the right side. Now, after that, we want to add the two numbers together. So we'll say, move my mouse, total is equal to input 1 plus input 2. And then once again, you write a comment saying this will add input 1 and input 2 to total. So this is why I needed the extra variable total here. So I wanted to add both of them and then have it stored in a variable called total here. All right. Now, I'm not done yet. I've taken in my inputs. All right, you can see that right here. I've taken in my inputs. And I've also done my equation. I've added my two numbers together. But remember, the user can't see any of this. The user can't see the addition that's happening. So we need to output this in some way, shape, or form. Now, there are two ways to do this that we've learned so far. You can do a label or you can do a message box. Remember the coding for our message box. It's MessageBox.show. All right, remember MessageBox.show. It's built into Visual Studio. It's not a common control. All right. And then open close parentheses. Now remember, now what we're going to do is we're going to show something in the message box. And what I want to show is a message that says the total is. All right. Now remember, what I have here is I have some message in between these two quotation marks. Remember, quotation marks will indicate that this is a string value. All right. Now, what we need to add after this is that ampersand, or the and symbol, that should be located right above your number 7 on the keyboard. So when you add the and in there, that's telling the computer, hey, I have something else coming. So the message box is going to show the total is, and then we want to be able to show the total and the actual variable that we calculated earlier. So we'll put total in here. Remember, the and symbol tells the computer something is coming. So you need to make sure you add something to the very end of that. Okay? So let's walk through the coding one more time. Here I have my 3 variables that I've declared: input 1, input 2, and total. All right, remember, these are my 2 inputs I'm taking from the text box, and this is my total that I'm going to use to add them with. Here I'm actually taking my input from the text box, here and here, and then here I'm adding my inputs together to total. Remember, total is my variable to hold that value. And then finally, I have a message box here that's going to display the total. All right, again, the total is, and then and total. Now, remember my order. Programming, everything is sequential, so this has to be done in this order. If you reverse the order or something, you won't get the right answer. So let's run it, and let's kind of see what happens. All right, so we're going to hit the start button, and we should see that when I click on button, or when I put in my inputs and then click on button 1, I should add those values together. All right, and there we go. So here's my program. Let's say I'll put the number 5, and let's put the number 3 in here. Now again, I haven't clicked the button yet. All I've done is put 2 numbers in my text box. Now the moment I hit my button, all right, it's going to take in both these numbers. It's going to put them into my inputs. It's going to add them together, and then it's going to display it in a message box. I'm going to do it really, really quick. And there we go. All right, so the moment I click the button, it calculates that number properly. All right, and it calculates the correct answer of 8. Now, this works for numbers, all right? Now, one of the things I did mention in class was if you put a string in here, for example, let's say I put the word Bob instead of an actual number. Remember, the variable here, this is going into text box 2. The variable for input 2 is expecting what? It's expecting an integer. So because I put a string value in here, this will actually crash the program. Let me show you. So if I click on the button 1 now, you'll kind of notice the program kind of crashes, and now it highlights this, basically saying that I've entered in a string when the program was expecting a integer. All right, and so that's okay for right now if your program does that, but I just wanted to make you aware that when you're testing your programs, you need to make sure that you're actually putting in numbers for your text boxes. So this will conclude this kind of quick lesson and a kind of review lesson on variables and text boxes and inputs, and then also using the message box. All right. So again, a couple things to make note of is just simply how we declare our variables. All right, remember it's dim, whatever the variable name, as the data type. And then remember, we want to do everything usually within one button. All right, and then this button here, we're going to take in the inputs from the text box. Again, you can see that here and here. Then you're going to add those numbers together. And then finally, you would display it in a message box here. Again, just kind of note the syntax or how you write the message box right there.